I'm Alistair Daniel, and I am a storyteller and a consultant in the educational applications of storytelling and narrative thought. In this presentation, I'm going to be reflecting on a project that I have been working on with the education team from the Royal Armouries in Leeds. Now, the Royal Armouries is Britain's oldest public museum. It is the national collection of arms and armour, and it has three sites. One in Leeds, where I have been working. There's also the one in Portsmouth, and there's the original museum at the Tower of London. I am going back to Leeds tomorrow for the third iteration of the Mightier Than the Sword project, but last weekend I was giving this presentation at the UK Literacy Association International Conference in Brighton. The Mightier Than the Sword project is based around the artifact, the Tower Vechtbuch, which is Europe's oldest manual on sword fighting, and it is kept at the Royal Armouries in Leeds. This medieval fight book is full of illustrations showing you how to stand and move when you are fighting with a sword and buckler, a round shield. So here on the left we have the priest, who is the teacher in the top picture, and on the right is his student, who is called the scholar. But at the end of the text, the final couple of pages, we find the scholar disappears. And he is replaced by someone else. And that person isn't given a title of the student or the scholar. No, that person, who we can see in the bottom picture on the left, they are given the name Walpurgis, which means that that person is a woman, which challenges all kinds of perceptions around the role of women in medieval society and makes this text perfect as a focus for working with children. I'm not going to read all of these aims verbatim. I'm simply going to summarize most of them. That we aimed to increase oracy and literacy skills and confidence in Key Stage 2 pupils through the project. We wanted to introduce the children to the Royal Armouries collection and increase their knowledge of arms and armour, but also the wider medieval society, but also support teachers in how to use museum collections with their pupils. But if we look at that middle aim, provide a safe space for pupils to discuss issues like misogyny, social class and politics, and think about that medieval manuscript where the male student is replaced by Walpurgis, a woman who is learning to fight with a sword and shield. That opened up a space for us, and when I say us, I mean the museum education team and me, for us to explore with the children through story and dramatization all of these issues, and it provided a very rich theme for discussion. This presentation's title uses the phrase cultural capital, but cultural capital is a contested term, not least because it is used by Ofsted as part of their inspection of English schools. So if we see on this slide an extract from the School Inspection Handbook, inspectors will consider the extent to which schools are equipping pupils with the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Our understanding of knowledge and cultural capital is derived from the following wording. It is the essential knowledge that pupils need to be educated citizens, introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, and helping to engender an appreciation of human creativity and achievement. Now, Ofsted have said here this is taken from the national curriculum. Well, actually, this is hugely influenced by Matthew Arnold, who suggested that children need to be educated in all that was best, and what was best usually meant European. But let's think a little more broadly about that notion of cultural capital. The phrase cultural capital comes from the work of Bourdieu. And Bourdieu doesn't simply say that cultural capital is about the best that is thought and said. He suggests that cultural capital comes in three forms. We can have objectified cultural capital, institutional cultural capital, and embodied cultural capital. Now, let's think about exactly what is meant by cultural capital then. To define cultural capital as a neat summary, I'm using the work of Berger here, and we're going to look at simply the red text that cultural capital is all the skills and facilities that function as assets and liabilities in some contexts in the cultural performances of everyday life. Now, the fact that it says capital suggests that there is value attached to this, which is what Bourdieu is interested in, is how we ascribe value to the culture that children bring with them and children are exposed to. So we might say that standard English has a high value because of the way society views language, whereas dialectal English may not be seen as having such a high value. It is still cultural capital. We may think that being able to quote Shakespeare, or as one of our recent prime ministers did, be able to just pick out Latin phrases and drop them into conversation, we may think that has high cultural capital, but being able to quote something from a reality TV station has a low value cultural capital. But I want to go back to consider Bourdieu's three forms of cultural capital and how they apply in this context of the Royal Armouries and the project Mightier than the Sword. First of all, we can think about the objectified cultural capital, which is the collection of the Royal Armouries and in particular the Fechtbuch. Now, this is obviously a European publication. It's from Germany, so it has all that is attached to it coming from European culture. It is protected. It's behind glass, a glass box. We're not allowed to touch it. In fact, for the children to go and see it, they have to go through locked doors. So that has a high value as a piece of objectified cultural capital. Institutional cultural capital applies to me and the staff at the Royal Armouries Museum. The staff at the Royal Armouries, because they are employed by the Royal Armouries and have their badges. Me, as a freelancer being employed, thought worthy enough to be employed by an institution with the word royal in it, with the national collection of arms and armour. So that's institutional capital. Embodied cultural capital are all those dispositions that we have in ourselves. So our ability to use language, our ability to use our voices to convey meaning as we speak, to be able to write, to be able to read, to be able to move through space where other people are, to be able to command an audience, all of those things are part of the embodied cultural capital that we bring with us. And for the purposes of this presentation, we are considering particularly oracy as exemplified through oral storytelling and the oral storytelling that the children did. Let's look at the structure of the Mightier Than the Sword project. And the first thing was that the teachers came to the Royal Armouries for continuing professional development in storytelling. The location, of course, means that the teachers were out of school and could familiarise themselves with the place to which they were going to be bringing their classes. In terms of the training, they were being taught storytelling skills, so they're developing their own skills and confidence in storytelling, but also learning how to use storytelling pedagogically in their own classrooms and how to support children as storytellers. Going back to the embodied cultural capital, that includes the vocabulary that we have at our disposal. And so the schools were given classroom activities to do with the children to extend the children's understanding of medieval society, of how structured it was, of the place of women in medieval society, but also to introduce vocabulary to them that they could then draw upon in the museum activities, but also in the storytelling in their own schools. The children went to the museum and they engaged in dramatized activities and went to see the Fechtbuch itself. And then finally, my job was to go into the schools and work with the children, developing their own storytelling as they told the story of Walpurgis and explored the issues that had come up by looking at the Fechtbuch through story, through narrative. Before going any further, I need to define what storytelling means, because storytelling as a word, storytelling, is used in all kinds of contexts. You might say that, oh, Dame Judi Dench, her storytelling is wonderful when she acts. You might say, oh, J.K. Rowling's storytelling is wonderful in Harry Potter. The problem is that when we're talking about Dame Judi Dench, we're talking about her acting. When we're talking about J.K. Rowling, we're talking about writing. So when I am using the word storytelling in this context, I'm being very, very specific that storytelling is an oral practice that is the recounting of a narrative or part of a narrative that is reliant on the linguistic resources of the speaker and is performed in the absence of a written text. It's reliant on the linguistic resources of the speaker. So if I say to you, Marley was dead to begin with, there is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Now, those are not my words. Those are the words of Charles Dickens. So I'm saying in this context, in our context for this project and for oral storytelling in school, that is not storytelling. That is story recitation, because they are not my linguistic resources. If I told my own version of A Christmas Carol, where I created my own language around the story, that would be storytelling. But what I have just done for you is story recitation, not storytelling. So children are using their own linguistic resources. They are not reading a text, they are speaking it. There is nothing between them and the person with whom, or the people with whom they are telling. And it can be a whole story, or it can be a little fragment of a story. Quite often in conversation, we don't use whole stories. We use little bits of stories. I might say to you, oh, do you remember that time we got stuck in the lift? And you say, oh yeah, awful, wasn't it? But actually, that was a narrative fragment. It was part of a story. I didn't need to tell you the rest of the story because you had shared that experience with me. And we could think of it like an iceberg, that little bit I said was the visible bit sticking out of the water, but underneath it is a whole narrative formation that we didn't need to explore because it was unspoken between us. So why storytelling rather than any other kind of oral language with children? Simply because story is the way that we represent ourselves to the world, and the world represents itself to us. Even if we are looking at a table of statistics, of numbers, the only way we understand the significance of those is to place them within a story, why they were gathered, how they were gathered, what difference they will make. We use narrative construction to make sense of everything around us. Harold Rosen, Michael Rosen's father, said, and I might have got the word slightly wrong here, but he says, within every narrative is the ghost of non-narrative. In every non-narrative is the ghost of narrative. That narrative is so fundamental to what we do. It's the natural way that we think and we organize information. So we are using that to our advantage to enable the children to do all of the things that are in this diagram. First of all, they are using their knowledge of the world, which will include the vocabulary that they've done through the school activities and other learning about medieval society. It will come through their knowledge of how people respond to each other, of what sword fighting is. If they don't know what sword fighting is, how are they going to understand what happens next? They are using their knowledge of the environment within which people in the medieval society lived. So they know about castles, perhaps. So all of those things about the world they are bringing as they create story. I want to suggest that story has its own purpose. That when we tell a story to someone and we tell them a story that we're shaping, it has its own purpose because it's about our engagement with each other and sharing our world with each other. So story provides a meaningful context within which to hold all of this information around from our world, having selected it, of course, and chosen what is the most appropriate and rejecting that which is not appropriate. Storytelling is socially embodied. We tell our stories to and with other people, and they are there with us as we do it. And if they go, ooh, as we're talking, we will respond as we're storytelling. If they shudder or take a breath, we respond. It is dialogic in that sense, and it is dialogic through our physical, our embodied responses with and to each other. And because it is embodied, it values the non-verbal, it values things like making eye contact, of the tension in the body, of breath. All of those things are valuable, and we'll come on to that a little further in a moment. And story and making story is about making connections. We connect language with the thing that the language refers to. So we say shield, that refers to an object in the real world. We say walk, that relates to an activity in the real world. But we also make connections across the story. So when we are talking about Little Red Riding Hood, we make the connection with the fact that her mother told her not to leave the path because of the danger of the wolf, with the fact that the wolf meets her and wants to eat her and then eats up Granny. These are all connections we make as we tell story. So we make those connections across the story, and we create connections between the events as we narrate them. In the storytelling CPD for the teachers, we considered a lot of what I have just said in relation to the previous slide. So we thought about how we communicate, that it is not just about the language we use. And we thought about how storytelling is making sense of the world, but that our performance of story, how we use our bodies, how we use our voices, changes what the language means, so changes how the sense is made. Now I want to go to the subtitle of this slide: storytelling as a process rather than as a product. In primary schools in England, storytelling has for quite a while been framed as a product. I learn a story and I perform it to you. In these activities and in the work that I was do in the schools with the children, this was not the case. What we are looking at is using storytelling as a process. There was no final rehearsal and performance for each other. It's about developing story in the moment, developing our process of making story and communicating story in order to make connections, in order to develop our embodied cultural capital. Continuing with the idea of storytelling as a process, the lollipop sticks had a key role in one of the strategies, well, one of the main strategies for the storytelling in schools, where children told the story of Walpurgis in groups of 4, 5, or 6 children. They used the lollipop stick as a talking stick. Whoever holds the stick controls the story, but they also control how much they contribute. So a confident child may contribute a minute of Walpurgis's story and then pass the lollipop stick on. A less confident child may only say 2 words and pass the lollipop stick on. And if a child is struggling with what to say and how to say it, the rest of the group can help while they still hold the lollipop stick. Because this is about process, not about a beautifully formed product. It's about the process of making connections, finding language, and of using the performance, the embodied performance, to convey meaning as we share the story and make the story together. Now, Little Red Riding Hood is there because I used Little Red Riding Hood in the CPD session, because the teachers are familiar with Little Red Riding Hood and I want them to learn how to use this strategy. The classroom activities were around the understanding the stratified nature of medieval society, and there were 2 different versions. One is a desk-based version here with cards that you put on a sociogram. Another one is a more drama-based version where the children move around in role as these different people and the school could choose between them. The point that was made to the teachers always is not that the children get the layers of medieval society absolutely right, but they have the chance to explore and talk about power and social class and gender as they are engaged in these activities. As part of the children's visit to the Royal Armouries, they had a chance to see the Tower Fechtbuch in the museum library. And as I said, that involved going through locked doors. It meant meeting one of the librarians and looking through a glass case at something that was very precious. So here we see that objectified cultural capital coming through in that object. And for some of the children, this was the most significant aspect of the whole project, according to the feedback we had. In addition, The children had a chance to engage in some of the instruction from the Fecht book, having a go at learning to fight with a sword and a buckler. But they also got to meet Walpurgis, the priest, and the scholar in dramatised form, courtesy of the education team from the Royal Armouries. This project is called Mightier Than the Sword, and in that title you get a hint that actually the project isn't about fighting to get your way. It's about finding other ways, ways that are mightier than the sword, ways that are to do with language. So in the dramatization, when Walpurgis is humiliated by the male scholar because she's a woman learning to fight, the children empower her with language to overcome him. And we have two examples here of the words that children came up with to create poems, chants that they could call out for Walpurgis to give her strength. And those chants, those poems, then went back into the schools so the children could draw on that language as they told their stories. Again, going back to vocabulary, supporting them so that they had vocabulary already. When we start telling our stories, they have language that they can use and incorporate in the stories. So here we are in school, the storytelling session in school. And the storytelling uses only a few resources. There you can see a story mountain that the children can use if they wish to help them structure their stories. This is something that most schools use and that children are familiar with, but also the roll on the wall there, which is the picture with the two bodies. One is Walpurgis and the other is the scholar. And the children write on the outside what they think they look like, how they move, what they might sound like. And on the inside, they write the feelings and thoughts, the inner characters. So again, we're using the vocabulary, and of course, they can choose language from their chants, which we have taken from the Royal Armouries session to the school session. The Once Upon a Time, Yes, No, They All Lived Happily Ever After is all about embodying language. And that's a simple warm-up game, getting children to explore how changing your posture and your tone of voice and the speed at which you talk, how that can change what words mean. Last year's project was evaluated by Hopestone Research, and the feedback from the children and the teachers was overwhelmingly positive. And this is just a section from that report which points to the children really getting the idea that language is embodied and that meaning is changed by how we speak the words we say, how we move, how we use our voice, how we use gesture, all of those things coming together to convey meaning, which is one of the aspects that we were really keen to achieve. I also need to say that the evaluators found that the children completely got the questions around, or the issues around, misogyny in medieval society and the role of women, and they were able to make quite clear statements about what they felt, which links to the aims and objectives of the project. So let's return to embodied cultural capital, which I'm going to remind you, according to Berger, is the skills, the facilities that function as assets and liabilities in some contexts in the cultural performances of everyday life. So language, vocabulary, language structures, these are all part of embodied cultural capital. And by doing activities in school and by visiting the museum and working with the education team, the children explored a lot of domain-specific vocabulary that was related to the period, the medieval period, and the experience of Walpurgis learning to fight with a sword and buckler. But they also used language around emotion and empowerment, and all of that was brought together in the storytelling. And the embodiment of language, which I've already talked about how meaning is altered through the performance of the language in storytelling. The evaluation of ideas. Children had to choose what to say in their stories. They had to make choices about characters, about events, about attitudes. And when we make those choices when we tell a story, then we are evaluating it and showing the values that inform our lives. So we're encouraging children to make choices and to evaluate, but they also evaluate in how they say the words that they are using, how they use their demeanor, their breath. All of those things are contributing to saying what they think about the events, the people, the attitudes. The tellability of the story. One of the reasons for sharing the story mountain or reminding the children of the story mountain is the idea of rising tension and falling tension and a high point. Now, a high point occurs at the most interesting part of the story, and tellability is about why do we want to know about Walpurgis. Tellability is about understanding that when we want to tell a story to people, we have to give them something that is tellable, that they want to hear, that makes our story interesting to hear. And that is a life skill. That is an aspect of embodied cultural capital. Connections. The children are making connections and being able to connect ideas, being able to connect the language of affect, the language of emotion, with the language that is domain specific and related to history, being able to connect the events of the story together, being able to connect ideas. All of these things are part of embodied cultural capital that the children had to do in order to be able to tell their stories of Walpurgis. And continuing with that idea of making connections and language, we can think of story as a way of organizing language. So in the red boxes here, related to Little Red Riding Hood, we can see that story, we might have persuasive language. Take this basket of goodies to your grandmother because your grandmother is feeling sick. Taxonomic language, which is a list of things. So she gave Little Red Riding Hood's mother gave her a basket of goodies. There was an apple, there was some cake, there was some fruit juice. And the fact that we say those things and we don't say, and a pneumatic drill, because we understand that things go in classes and they are related to other objects that are similar or have a similar purpose. So this is all about logic and language coming together. Explanatory language. When the wolf asks Little Red Riding Hood, "Where are you going, little girl?" She says, "I'm going to see my granny because my granny is sick." And then the wolf says, "But you don't have any flowers. Take the flowers to your grandmother." More persuasive language. And the story not only contains as a frame all of these different types of language, it gives an opportunity to explore very different schemas. Schemas as way of holding ideas together. We have the story schema, which is everything together, but we also, that embedded in that is an event schema. An event schema is this happens, then this happens, and this happens, and this happens. That we understand things work in a sequence. We have the scene schema. She went into the dark forest, and as she went through the trees, in our heads, we've pictured the forest, and we might talk about the forest, creating descriptions of the forest, and that's a scene schema. And the matrix schema is recognizing that things belong together, things that granny might want to eat, things that can fit in a basket, and things that little girl can carry as well. So all of those ways of thinking come together, all those different ways of talking, of using language come together in a simple story of a few minutes. To finish, I want to take a critical stance in relation to this project, the Mightier Than the Sword project, and cultural capital. Starting with time. Now, let's look at what Bourdieu says here in the red text. The link between economic and cultural capital is established through the mediation of the time needed for acquisition. We value things that we give time to. Now, the schools have given a lot of time to this. They've given teachers time to go to the museum. They've given time to explore the activities in the classroom. They've given time to take the children to the museum. And then finally, they've given time for me to come into school. But in the end, I'm only with the children for an hour. An hour to acquire enough confidence with the language and the structures to create the story of Walpurgis. No, I am not criticizing the schools for me only having an hour, because I've already said they've given a lot of time, and that is difficult in the English curriculum. But if we are going to give spoken language value, if we are going to give storytelling, and I suggest that storytelling is a vital part of spoken language value, we need to make time for it in our schools. I want spoken language to be a significant part of the curriculum. I want storytelling to be a significant part of that spoken language curriculum. I want storytelling to be embedded as process in our teaching and learning. But as an enthusiast, I have to recognize that if we give the time to storytelling, or the time to spoken language in general, where does that time come from? This is a seesaw. And when we give time, we give value. And going back to the idea of objectified cultural capital, the fact that there is a museum full of artifacts from all over the world, and yet we focused on one European text from the Middle Ages, behind glass, behind a locked door that had to be interpreted for us by a librarian. All the time given to that rather than anything else in the museum. It's a seesaw, isn't it? But that doesn't mean we shouldn't, of course, because the Tower Effect book is amazing, and I hope you can see that this project has enabled children to explore the story of Walpurgis in ways that are significant enough for this to be the third time this year this project has run, for people to think in the museum to think it's worth investing in, and for schools to think it's worth investing the time in. But taking a critical stance, we need to question what we are doing all the time and ask, if this value is being given here, is there a danger it's being taken from elsewhere? I hope you've enjoyed this presentation and that you get something from it. If you have any questions or comments or brickbats, please go to my website, www.storyten.co.uk, and click Contact Alistair, and I will try and get back to you as quickly as I can with any suggestions, rebuttals, or insights that I may have. And thanks for any insights that you may give me.